Our next guest is important, and so is the issue. It relates to a story yesterday, I think afternoon, when the New Zealand Police, Detective Inspector Warwick Adkin by name, announced a $100,000 reward and possible immunity for prosecution at the county's Manukau police station yesterday in relationship to the murder of Arthur Easton. Arthur Easton was stabbed to death by an intruder, singular actually, who broke into his home in October 1985. Now you just think about where you were in October 1985. Oh God, that's a long time ago. October 1985, and a good number of you would be either in small pants or, in Josh's case, not even born. But Arthur Easton was stabbed to death, and that would be bad enough as a cold case anyhow, except that the police did arrest somebody and took him to the courts, and the courts found him guilty. They found Alan Hall, a socially challenged individual, I think you'd have to say, guilty of the murder of Arthur Easton, and they sentenced him to a long spell in prison. But the consequence of that and what happened next is where our guest comes in. Tim McKinnel is a former detective and now private investigator. He's been central to sorting out a number of a number of cases in which there has been injustice, Tainapora, Gail Maney, and now the Alan Hall case. And he certainly knows, one would assume, the Arthur Easton murder case inside out. And he joins us now. Tim, welcome to the show, and thank you so much for joining us.
Thanks for having me, Michael.
Okay, take us back. Take us back to October 1985, if you can, please. Arthur Easton is in bed, I assume. Is he alone? What's the story?
He's at home with his two teenage sons, and one of them heard an intruder enter the back door of the house, and pretty quickly what unfolded was a violent confrontation with the intruder and all three of the Easton family. That resulted in most of the Eastons, or all of the Eastons, getting injured, and sadly Arthur was fatally injured by the intruder with a bayonet that he had brought to the scene with him.
How do they know that there was a bayonet? Did they find the murder victim weapon?
The bayonet and the hat were left at the scene, and the offenders rushed to scamper after the physical fight with the three Eastons. They were left behind.
Right, and the two teenage boys, were they older teenage or young teenage boys, Tim?
16 and 18.
Okay, so they were old enough to have a good presence and awareness. And did they identify any distinguishing characteristics of the person that they confronted that night?
They were able to give a reasonable description of the person they were fighting. Most of those descriptions, he was wearing a hat on his head and was difficult to see, but certainly the physical attributes of the offender were able to be described by both of the Easton brothers quite well.
And what did this offender look like or appear to them?
They described the offender as at least 6 foot tall, muscular, strong like a bull, I think was the term that one of them used in describing the offender. They thought perhaps dark-skinned or Māori, but beyond that they couldn't give too much more. Strong arm muscles, those sorts of descriptions they were able to give on the basis of the physical fight they had.
Okay, and so the bayonets left, the father's dying or dead as a consequence. Must have been a horrific scene for them. They call the police investigate. Now, the police investigation, we know how it ended up, but how did it go so wrong so early?
Yeah, so the attack, the home invasion in 1985, and the initial stages of the investigation appeared, from what we've seen, to be unremarkable. They worked through a suspect list and spoke to different people in the community, but in early December, so several weeks later, Alan came to their attention because it appeared that that the hat and the bayonet might have belonged to him, or he might once have had those. And so he was picked up and interviewed by the police a couple of times, and very much became the focus of the police investigation from that point forth.
Were they connected with him, the hat and the bayonet?
Well, it's not absolutely 100% clear, but there is that can't be excluded. And I think that when Alan was shown a picture of the bayonet, he thought it was probably his, and likewise the hat was an unusual hat, and it was one that he and his brothers had used. But notably, they told the police at the time that they had that they'd gone missing from their house some weeks earlier.
Which is sort of, if this is a stalker or an intruder, is sort of credible, isn't it, that it could have been stolen? Are they in the same area as the Easton family?
Relatively close, yes, certainly within walking distance.
Okay, all right. So now, the physical characteristics at the time of Alan Hall, did they match the description that was given by the brothers?
Not in the slightest, no. And that was a real difficulty for the police. Alan, as we now know, is autistic, and he has a slightly different way of talking to and dealing with people. And perhaps that counted against him in terms of his interactions with the police. But in terms of the physical description, Alan was a 5'7", fairly slim, asthmatic bugger, so he didn't fit the description in the slightest. And so that was something that the police had to wrestle with as they decided whether or not to charge him.
Well, that would be just between you and me. I mean, you're the former detective, but to me that would have been that's not him then. They didn't think that. And why did they not think that?
I don't think it's unreasonable to describe Alan's initial interactions with the police and their interviews as atypical. As I said, we now know Alan is autistic, and that explains why, but they interpreted his behaviour and his responses in a way that made them suspicious. And they, to the extent they were prepared to put aside the physical description of the offender. I need to be a little bit careful because there is a court case underway, but in relation to what happened in terms of the prosecution, but needless to say that they were able to prosecute and have Alan convicted at trial. Okay.
How many times did he go to trial? Just the once?
Just one trial, and then repeated efforts through the Court of Appeal, and then 3 attempts for the Royal Prerogative of Mercy to the Governor-General. Petitions were made there, and repeated attempts to work with and tell his story to media over the years. And none of those really sort of got the traction they should have until Mike Wesley-Smith came along with his podcast, Grove Road.
Okay, and so the media got involved, investigated this particular issue. It then ended up, as I understand, in the Supreme Court. How did it... Was that because the murder conviction was quashed at the Supreme Court about 2 years ago, over 2 years ago now? How did it end up in the Supreme Court?
So Mike, as part of his podcast, spoke to me and asked me, just on the basis of other work I'd done, to have a look at the case, introduced us to the Hall family, and together with Nick Chisnell, KC, we sort of formulated a team and started preparing an appeal for Alan, following the podcast, basically. So we we relied on a lot of what Mike Wesley Smith had done. We got access to the police file and some other material and put together an appeal, and declared that appeal, as you say, just over 2 years ago.